Welcome back to Scripture Matters, and welcome to my channel, Frodi. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me on. This was an unexpected invitation, and hopefully, we're going to have a very fun conversation.
I think so. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And you thought it might be good to talk about Exodus 4. So, should we just immediately dive into it? I've
All
got the
right.
passage here.
Sure. Well, maybe I should give a little bit of background of
Yeah,
why I chose it,
great.
because I'm. I don't know. Have all the other guests, are they Christians? I'm not a Christian, so I'm coming at this from the
Uh,
outside, so to speak.
that's a good question. I think all of them so far probably have been, or at least are aligned with Christianity very strongly. Yes, you're right. You're probably the first one who wouldn't describe themselves as a Christian. Yeah.
Right. And so, of course, I could have chosen any number of passages from the Bible, but I chose one that has some philosophical significance, at least for me, because what I want to talk about a little bit is the idea of sort of the connection between morality and Christianity as a source of morality, and God as a source of morality, God as morally infallible, and so on. And so that's why I chose this passage, and I think it'll give us sort of a foundation to discuss those matters. So maybe I should read a little bit about. Let's start with where we're going to talk about Exodus. We're going to talk about Moses,
Yeah.
and I have my copy of the Bible here. So let me just find it.
Do you know which version it is? Because I can try and match up.
Well, it
Got a bunch
is
of versions
just
here.
the King
Is it
James.
King James? Great.
Yes, there we go. So let me just find it here. We're going to talk about Exodus. And sorry about this. I should have
That's all right.
prepared the
Shall I give a bit of
pages.
context? So,
Sure.
this is a passage talking about Moses. Moses is a guy who actually grew up in Pharaoh's household. The rest of the Israelites are all in captivity. He saw a guy being beaten, one of the Israelites being beaten by an Egyptian, and he murdered the guy who was doing the beating, and then ran away into exile for ages. He then saw the burning bush and got called by God to lead his people out of Egypt, out of slavery. He's got this special access to Pharaoh's household because he actually grew up almost like Egyptian royalty, but he is an Israelite. And spoilers, he will eventually successfully lead the people of Israel out of captivity, out of Egypt.
Exactly. So, I mean, I can just jump around here and mention some passages that I find are interesting or relevant to the topic that I want to discuss. And one is, for example, chapter 2, verse 12. And he said, when he murders the guy, the Egyptian, he says, and he looked this way and that way. And when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So he
Yeah.
murders this Egyptian and hides him in the sand. And then, for example, chapter 3, verses 19 to 22, for example, he's talking to God. Is this where he's talking to God? Yeah, I believe he is. And he says, I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, not by a mighty hand, and I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give his people favor in sight of the Egyptians, and it shall come to pass that when ye go, ye shall not go empty, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor, and of her that sojourneth in her house, jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and raiment, and ye shall put them upon your sons, and upon your daughters, and ye shall spoil the Egyptians. Harsh words.
Yeah. And kind of, I said spoiler earlier, but here is the narrative actually telling you what's about to happen in advance.
Exactly. Then we come to the passage that I've chosen, which is chapter 4, and it is verses 20, 21. And he says, let's start with 20. And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And the Lord said unto Moses, when thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all these wonders before the Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand, but I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. And I guess the point of this is quite obvious when we're going to talk about morality and Christianity, that this is a passage, or these passages show a morality that isn't really compatible with sort of more Christian moral sensibilities today. I believe you can probably agree with that.
Well, let me agree with you that a lot of Christians teach ideas that are incompatible with this passage. Yes, yeah, 100%.
Right.
In particular, I think the conflict that you're referring to, am I correct, is between free will on one hand as a kind of modern Christian doctrine, and then this idea of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. How can it be that God gives us free will, and yet in this instance he's prepared to harden Pharaoh's heart sort of against his will and control Pharaoh's actions, and then indeed judge Pharaoh based on things that he only did because God first hardened his heart to do it?
Yeah, there seems to be some sort of paradox there, where God punishes Pharaoh for something that he forced Pharaoh to do, and this seems kind of I don't know, counterintuitive, and also that he chose a murderer. I mean, Moses was a murderer, and so he chose a murderer as his man to do his work. And also he threatened these to inflict these things upon Pharaoh and his people, that kill the firstborn and so on. It's quite severe punishment, and like I said, I don't think that is sort of compatible with what most Christians today see as their sort of moral sensibilities.
Yeah, and I think my opinion on this is that what you're identifying is correctly what the Bible teaches, and that therefore most Christians have incorrect understandings. Their theology is wrong. And actually, if we dig into other bits of the Bible, I think we'll see the totality of Scripture making sense together, but not matching what Christians tend to believe in the sort of cleaned up, sanitized version of Christianity that we always end up hearing.
Right. Yes. I mean, the points that I want to make aren't really about Christianity or God as a source of moral knowledge, because I mean, one guilty pleasure that I have is that I like to watch these debates between William Lane Craig and these other people, right? So like creationist debates or debates about the existence of God and so on. And I think specifically for Christianity, there is this idea of morality at the center of the religion. And so the idea or the problem of evil, for example, or the problem of suffering in the face of the existence of an all-powerful and good, morally good God is difficult. And it seems to be that is a central problem that it really isn't for a lot of other religions. So it seems like Christianity is quite unique in the sense that the moral issue is really at the core here. And I mean, one example is that Descartes, for example, he uses morality as well. It's the question of morality rather than scientific questions or other philosophical questions that causes belief or disbelief in God and Christianity. And so, I mean, we can talk about the ontological argument or the cosmological argument and those things, but they seem to not be very important. It seems like a lot of people are more swayed by the moral arguments, both in
Yeah.
favor and against Christianity.
Yeah. Do you just want to explain what the problem of evil is that you referred to, and then also why might somebody believe in Christianity from a moral starting point? How can the question of morality almost lead you either for or against Christianity?
Well, the problem of evil is quite simple, really. But the premise is that God is all powerful and God is all good. So he has the power to prevent evil, and he's all good. So surely he wants to prevent evil. Still, evil exists in the world. So there seems to be some contradiction here. So that either maybe God isn't all powerful or he isn't all good. No Christian would probably accept either of those claims. And so there is a problem there. And it seems that problem has convinced a lot of people to not accept Christianity. I can think of one example. I like Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you like Bart Ehrman.
I like you, I've had a guilty pleasure of listening to all these debates. So I find Bert Ehrman fascinating to listen to. I think I've had a few difficulties with some of his conclusions, but he's certainly worth listening to. I do enjoy his output.
Yeah, me too. And one of the things that he has said in his lectures is that, well, when studying the Bible, I mean, he is, for those who are not familiar with him, he's a prominent Bible scholar. So he studies the Bible, and he's written a lot of sort of popular works on that. And it wasn't really any of the problems in the Bible tradition or in translations or anything like that sort of caused him to doubt, because he started out as a Christian and now he isn't really a Christian anymore. It was really the problem of evil, he said, that convinced him that, well, no, I can't remain a Christian because I just can't reconcile this problem in my head that if God is morally infallible and all-powerful, why does he allow all this suffering to happen? And I think that's sort of symbolized here in the hardening of the heart of the Pharaoh, that this doesn't seem to be what a morally infallible and good God would do.
I think that the problem of evil might be the most common reason for people to lose their faith. I think that might be the number one. People just cannot reconcile the evil that they see in the world, as you say, with a good God and an all-powerful God. And they say, the Bible clearly says that God is all good, and the Bible clearly says that God is all-powerful. So therefore, either I throw out the Bible, or I have to somehow believe that God is okay with all of this evil stuff that's going on. And I think free will is often the kind of wriggle out answer that people go for, right? We can explain away evil because God's overriding reason for allowing evil is because he had to have free will, which is why then a passage like this causes so much trouble, because this appears to be the Bible saying free will also isn't the answer. So I think that's where free will ends up becoming a key, like, cornerstone theology, but I actually have quite a weak position on free will. I think because of passages like this, and I also want at some point to go and have a look at Romans 9, and possibly a bit of an Ephesians. And I think we can see that actually the idea of God hardening people's hearts isn't unique to Exodus, not unique to the Old Testament, but actually is seen throughout the Bible. And then we have to figure out what to do with that. Like, how then can we answer the problem of evil, maybe?
Yeah, so this poses a couple of problems, I think, at least for probably sort of modern Christians who have like a pretty mainstream view of what Christian morality is, right? And there are two problems here. One is that, well, if this kind of morality, if God was an advocate of this kind of morality in one place and something that seems contradictory in another place, then the conclusion must be that God isn't infallible. I mean, if God changed his mind about what is morally good, then he seems to be a vague, or Christianity seems to be a vague or kind of uncertain source of moral knowledge.
Well, and moreover, the Bible says that God is unchanging. So then the whole book seems to be unreliable. And then how do you believe any of it if some of it falls down, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one part that, well, it seems, at least to me as a layman, I'm not an expert, of course, but it seems that there are contradictory views, and so it seems like God changes his mind. And I mean, this has caused problems throughout history for people who've studied the Bible. I guess people like what's his name, Marcion, the early sort of heretic. He considered the Old Testament and the New Testament to be like that two different gods, or essentially Satan in the Old Testament, because he couldn't reconcile these sort of contradictions between different moral values in the old God and the new God, right?
Yeah. And some form of Marcionism, I think, is pretty common in most people's minds these days, that you think of the Old Testament God as this wrathful, avenging, violent figure who's casting down lightning from the sky and just in a bad mood constantly. And then you arrive at Jesus, who presents you with this kind of hippie-ish, placid God who's lost all of the fervor, but is full of forgiveness and welcoming.
Exactly. So there seems to be that kind of contradiction. That is God really? Does he change his mind, or are these contradictions not really there? And then there's, of course, a question of knowledge. I mean, if Christians get their knowledge of morality from their religion,
yeah,
well, how do they pick and choose? I mean, because you have to sort of emphasize certain things and not others. And so it would seem that you have to get your moral values from somewhere else, and then you sort of pick and choose which values you want to emphasize to fit something that you already believe in, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think a lot of what you're saying is very valid. If there's contradictions in the Bible, it makes the whole project of being a Christian a sort of a buffet project. Just pick whichever bits suit you at whatever time. Throw out the verses that you don't like. And I certainly think that we can reconcile everything together and deal with all the contradictions that people bring forwards. So let's dig into this a bit then. So Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and the word that's being used for harden there is used in other places to sort of mean strengthen, or like harden as in like a material becoming stiffer as it sets. It's that kind of like, if you imagine Pharaoh's heart was wavering one way or the other, he's decided he's going to cast out the people, and then God says, I'm going to make you could almost say, I'll strengthen Pharaoh's resolve, right? I'm going to make sure that Pharaoh doesn't change his mind later. That'll really mess up the whole plan I've got for for showing. I mean, ultimately, the results of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is that God does the plagues. You might remember the story is that he does 10 successive plagues, each plague being something obviously miraculous and powerful that displays God's power. And then every time Pharaoh says, I'm not letting the people go, and then God does another display of his power. So if Pharaoh had let the people go immediately, in a weird way, God wouldn't have got to show off all of his incredible... He wouldn't have got to make the Nile turn into blood and send all of the crickets and all the other hijinks that happens. So we definitely see God intervening in Pharaoh's heart to make him not change his mind on his initial trajectory. He said, I'm not going to let the people go. And indeed, in the passage you mentioned, what was it, chapter 2 or 3, where he actually foresees Pharaoh's decision in the first place. So he not only sees in advance what Pharaoh is going to do, he then intervenes to make sure that Pharaoh doesn't change his mind.
3:19 to 22, I think that was what I read there. And he essentially encourages Moses to plunder the people as well. I mean, to take their treasures and so on.
Yes. Oh, there's so many issues. You're going to tempt me into a sort of 4-hour stream here. So let's stay on track here. But yes, certainly there is a lot more warmongering and violence commanded by God in the Old Testament than Christians, especially middle-class British Christians that I often interact with, are comfortable with. So that's a really interesting discussion that I'd love to have. But let's stick on the trail for the minute of free will. So he says, the Pharaoh's, I'm sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. So this is seeing in advance what somebody will do in the future. And then, as we just read, the hardening of the heart, the solidifying of the resolve. Do you mind if we just dash off to a New Testament book? So Romans 9. This is a book written by a guy called Paul, who I think clarifies a lot of stuff that's left a little bit ambiguous in the Old Testament, in what I think is a helpful way, but in a way which some Christians actually find difficult to deal with, because I think, as we'll see, where is it? Yes, great. So, therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will hardeneth. So I think quite clearly this is a reference to the same idea of hardening. He's saying some people he will harden and some people he will have mercy, even though they initially resisted him, and he will let them repent. Thou wilt say then unto me, why doth he yet find fault for who hath resisted his will? So Paul's there saying almost the same exact objection that we were just talking about, right? How can God judge people, for example, Pharaoh, for doing something which actually ultimately was God's will? Right? How can you find fault in Pharaoh? Because how was Pharaoh supposed to resist the will of God? He obviously can't, so you can't find fault in Pharaoh. So let's keep reading and see what Paul says in response to this. Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? The language from the King James is a little bit tricky to pick through, but he's sort of saying, almost like, how dare you even ask this question? Then he says, shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump, to make one vessel unto honour, and another unto dishonour? What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy which he had afore prepared unto glory. So I don't know if you were following that, but I actually think you could pretty much reach this conclusion from the passage we read in Exodus, but here it's being made really explicit. God doesn't have any problem with making people who are destined for destruction. And actually, the reason that he might do this is not to do with free will, but is something to do with making known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy. So in other words, those people who are unlike Pharaoh, whose hearts don't become hardened and who are allowed to then come to God, learn something about God because of the ultimate fate of the people who are these vessels of wrath. So what do you make of this little bit of Romans?
Well, yeah, no, I it's obvious that it questions the sort of the free will, just like you say, and I think there's a lot of sort of common sense or even modern scientific reasons to question free will. I mean, people discuss nature and nurture, right? I mean, you're born with certain setup in genetic setup, and you have an environment, and with those two factors, there's very little room left for free will. It seems so. It makes sense from that point of view, but it's kind of difficult to reconcile, still for me at least, with. It seems very random in a sense that, well, God would pick this guy, this poor guy, the Pharaoh, and he's just a pawn in the game, and he's punished quite severely and very harshly for something that he didn't do, and that sort of it seems like morality requires free will. Otherwise, how is it good? I mean, what? How can a person be good if he couldn't do otherwise, right? I mean, this is something that Immanuel Kant, for example, brings up. That, I mean, the morality requires that you have options. I mean, otherwise you can't choose the moral option.
You said there that Pharaoh was being punished, or the sinner in general is being punished for something that he didn't do. But actually, I think what you mean is he's being punished for something that he didn't choose freely, because he ultimately did do the sinful thing. So the punishment as a result of the deed is working exactly the same as we always thought it did. You do the thing that's wrong, and then you get punished for it. The difference is that you did the thing, but you didn't have this sort of mystical free will choice. Although I think on serious reflection, the concept of free will, as you indicate with the nature-nurture stuff, which is, I mean, really worth meditating on and trying to think through, I'm not sure the idea is very coherent in the first place. I mean, of course, our decisions are influenced by a combination of who we were born as without our choice and what happens to us during our lives. You know, most people are prepared to accept that. And the question is, should people be punished for the things that they do regardless of their background? But if every mistake we make is ultimately the results of something that happens to us, then we wouldn't be culpable for anything. So the whole concept of morality actually disappears in a puff of smoke if you think too hard about it in that direction either.
No, I mean, and that's really at the core of for example, the modern legal system, that people are being they're treated like patients almost. They're not being punished because well they well, at least in the sort of in the worldview that we have now, or that mainstream society has now, they're not really at fault for their actions because economic factors, or they were poor, or something like that, right? And but I do think that there is this is sort of a sort of a minor sort of or a subtle philosophical point that action itself requires free will, because otherwise it isn't an action, it's a behavior. I mean, there's a difference between me if I fall from a roof and land on top of you and harm you through no will of my own, or I didn't choose to do that, versus me choosing to jump off a roof and harm you. There's a more, that's where the moral difference is. And if there is no free will, then the whole idea of acting, it isn't an action, because an action requires some sort of free will, and that's a requirement for morality. So if we accept that free will doesn't exist, I do think that we have to sort of give up morality in a sense.
I think perhaps that is the that idea that morality only makes sense because of the existence of free will is actually an instinct that we have from having been brought up with these Christian ideas, which I think aren't even Christian ideas. But there's no logical reason that God couldn't punish people for what they do without any idea of free will. But I think a lot of people want to believe that that's true. And then you end up in the case of, are you going to disbelieve in God because he's different from the type of God that you would like to believe in? Rather than the question of, is there actually a logical contradiction, or is there a contradiction between parts of the Bible? I think the Bible hangs together in saying that ultimately the people who are saved are not different from the people who aren't saved by anything ultimately other than God's choice. And that's something that causes a lot of people difficulty. I think most people's conception of God doesn't contain that idea fundamentally. And then if you encounter that in the Bible, a lot of people react against it and say, that can't be right. That's not the sort of God that I would want to worship. I want to believe in a God who chooses people based on something inside them that made the right choice. This free will spark. But I think that idea just isn't in the text. So you're faced with either, again, are you going to accept or deny what's revealed in Scripture and put up with whatever it says, or are you going to do this buffet idea where you just believe the nice things that you wish it said, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right about that, and but I do think that it contradicts what probably most people think is the Christian moral sense. I mean, because there are other, there are other images of gods. I mean, non-Christian images of gods that are completely amoral. I mean, they're neither good nor bad. They're just sort of super powerful beings. but we can't say that they're all good. And I think this brings God into sort of a realm like that, where the sort of the whole idea of us getting our morality from there, or moral sensibilities, is sort of questionable.
Interesting.
If God is like that he, I mean, that there seems to be
it's
a certain
arbitrary.
It's arbitrary, exactly. There's a certain sort of randomness to it.
Yeah, I mean, you see that in this passage, right? The potter has the same lump of clay, and one moment he's forming something that's going to be a vessel of honor, and the next minute he's forming something that's going to be a vessel of destruction. And the vessel is absolutely unable to to complain about which ultimate destiny it ends up with. So I think this is an issue for a lot of Christians because they fundamentally think that they are better than other people because they're like, I'm a Christian, I made the right choice, and therefore God loves me. And actually, that isn't the attitude that Christians should have. It should be, I got lucky that God picked me. I could easily have been a vessel for destruction, but God chose me. The contradiction that a lot of people would bring up is other passages which talk about how Jesus died for the world, and anybody who chooses to follow Jesus will be saved. Does that seem like a contradiction to you? I don't know. I'm willing to go into that if you like, but I don't think that's quite the. You were more bringing up the popular conception of how God operates.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I was thinking about was more I mean, when I see a lot of Christians talking about these issues, they usually say that if you're not a Christian, it's because you don't want to live up to the moral requirements, for example, of being a Christian,
Right. Yeah.
or that without Christianity, people would just be immoral barbarians. And
Right.
I mean, there's this Dostoevsky. Let me see if I can find it. There's a quote. I mean, it's a classical thing in Crime and Punishment, where he says that, well, it's usually referred to as, well, without God, anything is permitted, right? Mm-hmm. And he also says here, and there's a letter, he says, now suppose that there is no God or immortality of the soul. Now tell me, why should I live righteously and do good deeds if I die entirely on earth? And if so, why should I not cut the throat of another man? So there seems to be, I mean, this isn't from the Bible, that's from Dostoevsky, but that seems to be a very popular conception among Christians, that we get this moral, that without Christianity, we would be immoral barbarians. And my point here is that, well, that doesn't really seem to fit with the image of God that is presented in the Bible. That these sort of moral sensibilities that modern Christians have of themselves being civilized, whereas if they didn't have Christianity, they would be sort of uncivilized, immoral barbarians. That doesn't really fit with the image of God's morality in the Bible. And so my point is that, well, perhaps this Christian morality doesn't come from Christianity. I mean, it comes from elsewhere, and so on, right? So there seems to be some sort of contradictions involved here in that conception of morality. And I mean, if you go along with your the thing you described, that isn't really what most Christians would, well, at least in the sort of in the West today, would accept.
No, I think it's a tough thing to grapple with. I'm not sure that a Christian has to understand this correctly in order to be saved. So that's an interesting wrinkle, that there could be a lot of Christians who believe things that are wrong, and yet they are actually saved. So it's kind of a distinction between what does the Bible say, and if you figure out that the Bible doesn't make sense, then I think fair enough, throw it away. But if you find contradictions between lots of different Christians who believe all kinds of different things, that's not necessarily I don't find that surprising in some ways, because people can believe 99% incorrectly about God and his nature, but if they still have a real relationship with him, that's what matters. And that, I think, is what the definition of a Christian is to me, not just having correct understanding of all these things. I mean, the question of, is a Christian a better person, a morally better person? Like, okay, fine, you're a vessel for destruction, or you're a vessel for honorable purposes, would you be able to distinguish between these two groups just looking at the way that they live their lives? And I think that the answer is yes, but I don't. But I think it's a subtle effect. That there's other passages in the Bible that talk about how you can tell somebody is a Christian because they start to bear the fruits of good deeds, good works. But it's not a binary switch. It's not like before you're a Christian, you're 100% evil all the time, and then you become a Christian and you're just perfect monk that never does anything wrong. It's more that you gradually mature and become a more gracious and loving and patient, etc. sort of person. But I think the correct way to look at humanity is that it is mostly people who are sinful, who occasionally do things that are good, but nonetheless fall way short of the moral potential that human beings could have reached. And that actually, that continues to be true even once you are a Christian, that even though you're slowly improving, you're still such a long way short of the moral perfection of Jesus, or the moral perfection that we will have in the new creation. So I don't think we could do a litmus test and say, are you going to cheat on your tax returns? Yes, no. I found all of the Christians.
Well, but my point with that was more that it doesn't really seem to sort of fit reality. This sort of description that without God everything is permitted. I mean, because that sort of suggests that, well, you would go around stabbing children if it wasn't because you feared punishment from God if you did it. Most people don't want to do that, so they have moral sensibilities from elsewhere. But one thing that I wanted to ask you is, I mean, regarding contradictions in the Bible, or if there are contradictions at all, but it seems to me that, I mean, if God chose a man to do his work on earth, the man he chose in Moses or in Joshua in Jericho, like just laying everything, I mean, it's basically committing genocide, versus Jesus, who has a completely different moral conception. There seems to be, I mean, there isn't perhaps a logical contradiction, but there seems to be that that he advocates kind of contradictory versions of morality in the people that he chooses to do his bidding in the Old Testament versus the morality that is advocated in the New Testament. Would you say that?
I think it would be unfair to say that all of Jesus's teaching is a self-contained moral idea that holds together, and that the Old Testament is a self-contained moral idea that holds together, and that they're in conflict with one another. For example, if we just look at things that Jesus said, here we are in Matthew, and he says, "Think not that I come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." And this is not unique. There's quite a few verses that you could take out from Jesus's teaching, which seem completely at odds with the popular conception of what Jesus was saying. So I think you have to look at, is this a contradiction within Jesus's teaching? And likewise, I think you can find both extremes in the Old Testament.
Right. I mean, well, what I would say to that is that, well, yeah, that's a quote. But if we look at these men who do God's work, if we just say that, it's quite clear that the Moses and Joshua were sort of warlords. in that
Right.
sense, right? Whereas
Yeah,
Jesus
yeah,
was
yeah,
not a
yeah.
warlord. I mean, he
No.
was sort of closer to something like a Buddhist monk or something like that, and he allowed
Yeah.
himself to be killed. That wasn't really the case with the sort of leaders in the Old Testament. So if we see
Yeah.
them as sort of moral role models, they're very different types.
Yeah. People, and indeed Jesus' followers, thought that he was going to be a leader in the mold of Moses or Joshua. They expected that they were following him around for a few years as he amassed his troops, and then they were going to go and take down the Romans. And they were quite surprised when he then got captured. And I think whilst he was captured, they still didn't quite know what was going to happen, even though he had told them what to expect. But it was so completely different from what they were preparing themselves for that they just were completely blindsided. He actually got killed in a very humiliating way that the Romans were like, completely, we've triumphed here, and also the Jewish Sanhedrin, right? And it seemed like Jesus' mission had been a failure because they also were thinking in the terms of the old, of these old, as you say, warlord style of leaders from the Old Testament. So I think Jesus had a different mission. His role led him down a different path, but not because had Jesus been in Joshua's place or Moses's place, he would have done differently. I don't think it's a difference in morality so much as a difference in context. I mean, Jesus came on earth to die, and in his dying, he conquered death. His death was a sort of substitutionary situation, and in so doing, he brought about a spiritual kingdom. Whereas in the Old Testament, it was very much about time and place. God was saying, I'm going to have a people on earth geographically, and I'm going to have a nation, and they're going to represent me. And therefore, in order to preserve the nation, they need to maraud around and slaughter people and take up space and protect their borders and all these kinds of nationalist type of activities. But Jesus's role was misunderstood until after the fact, and then you start to understand what his teaching was about, which was his mission is not about making a nation, but actually making a cross-national kingdom where the place that God rules over isn't land, but is inside people's hearts.
Right, but if we then see, so if we see Christianity as the source of moral knowledge, that people get their moral ideas from Christianity, then would you say that it is permissible to imitate a Moses or a Joshua and commit genocide, kill children, and plunder? Is that compatible with Christian morality, or has the morality changed in that sense?
That's a great question. I think I don't want to give a trite answer, because fundamentally the situations we see in the Old Testament are often cases where God has given people a specific instruction to go and do something, and therefore that mission is kind of divinely sanctioned. But that isn't to say necessarily that there isn't so is it acceptable for Christians to support warfare in general? I think yes, under certain circumstances. But I think you do have to be a little bit careful of just saying, well, we saw God command this behavior here, and therefore that specific instruction can just be followed under any circumstance. Is that a fair? I hope I'm not coming across like I'm evading the question. I'm saying that what we see clearly is that God approved of warfare under certain circumstances. And therefore, that remains true. That's under certain circumstances, God might approve of warfare. And I don't think there is anything in Jesus' teaching which would contradict that. Now, he taught a lot about turn the other cheek, right? Things like this. Be a forgiving person. He said, is it acceptable that the Romans are extracting a tax from the Jews? Well, he said, give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God what is God's. It sounds like he's saying, just be peaceful at all times. I think that's a misreading, and actually, the better understanding is more like, where should our focus be? Most people throughout most of history, most Christians, should be individually forgiving. But if you happen to be a ruler who's making a decision about whether you should invade another country, that's a different question. And that's not what's being addressed by turn the other cheek, I think.
Right. Well, but that seems to sort of support my claim that in that case, Christianity or the Bible or God or call it what you will, is not a very clear source of moral knowledge then. I mean, if people claim that this is where they get their morality from, well, there seems to be a lot of different things to choose from. And how do you know which one is applicable? Then you have to go to some source outside of the Bible or outside of Christianity in order to decide what to do in that. I mean, it seems to be then that it's actually not a very clear source of moral knowledge.
I think I'd agree to the extent that a lot of people wish the Bible was a rule book, and it just isn't that. You
Right.
get very clear moral instructions on a small number of cases. You get an enormous amount of what amounts to kind of case law, right? Here's a situation, and here's how the people dealt with it, and then here's some indication of whether or not that was the wise path or not. You get, here's Jesus acting in a bunch of situations, and certainly his behavior is approved of in every case. But in your day-to-day life, you will almost certainly face moral dilemmas that are not covered explicitly by the Bible. And so the way that you use the Bible to guide your life is through a combination of studying it and trying to get a feeling for the principles therein, as well as making sure that there isn't clear instruction there. I think we do rely on guidance, divine, miraculous guidance via the Holy Spirit. So there's a certain amount of it's not just the Bible. I think what you're basically saying is correct, that the Bible does not contain a total moral system that's obvious how you follow it, and there's many cases in which I would say I can see the situation has very good arguments that a Christian could, with good conscience, do A or B, and it's down to their personal decision. So yes, I think you're right. There's lots of ways in which the Bible is not this total law book, and indeed, I have to say, the Bible has been used through history as a justification for lots of things that are contradictory with each other. So if you wanted to, you could twist the text to say just about anything that you wanted. Right. I think if you're an honest actor, you will come to the Bible and say, what is the best understanding of it? But if you're a dishonest actor coming to it and you just want to say, can the text be made to say what I want? Almost certainly yes.
Right, but then you don't think then that the sort of the Old Testament has been superseded by sort of a new morality in the New Testament. You think that they're still compatible, so that in certain circumstances, God still thinks that like genocide, just like in Jericho, is permissible, and plunder and things like that, that is sort of could be compatible with what a good Christian does. It hasn't been
Well,
made obsolete by the
well,
wars.
there is an aspect to the Bible which I should explain quickly, which is so there's lots of different bits of the Bible. You get a bit of history explaining sort of what happened at the beginning of the world, and God chooses out Abraham and makes a covenant with him. And then a bit of time goes by and he makes another covenant with one of Abraham's descendants. And indeed, Moses, who is thought of as the person who kind of penned or collected together the whole of the first 5 books, including there's books like Deuteronomy and Leviticus, which are almost like giant sermons or talks that Moses gave. And those are part of God's specific agreement with the people of Israel. And he said, you're my people, I'm going to bless you, and you in return are going to follow this giant set of rules. And that contains things like sacrifice in the temple and get circumcised and don't eat shellfish and all of these kinds of things. Then you get wisdom books and poems, and then also the rest of the history of what happened after Moses, which is essentially the people not following most of the laws that they'd just been given. And as a result, they get attacked and they lose their land and go into exile. Now, the temple gets destroyed and rebuilt in a sort of half-hearted way. So the temple was around in Jesus's day, and people were still there doing some of the sacrifices and following some of the Mosaic law. But Jesus makes clear that actually, and we can see it in Romans, which is the book we were just in a second ago. So Romans, let's go Romans 2. Romans makes quite clear that like nobody is following the rules, including the Jewish people, but God's made an alternative way which doesn't rely on any of the sacrificing and stuff. Here we go. There's none righteous, no one that understands. They've all gone their own way. These are all Old Testament quotes that have been kind of copied and pasted into Romans. Sorry, this is a long answer, but I think it's useful to put down a clarification here. So, but now a righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So without the law here is specifically meaning all of the specific instructions that were given to the people of Israel. So you can have righteousness, or in other words, you can be the vessel of honor rather than the vessel of destruction, not by following all the laws, which no one managed to do, but instead by this alternative route through Jesus. And it's actually made really explicit, and quite a lot of focus is put on don't follow the Mosaic law anymore. For example, don't get circumcised. There's a fun bit in a different letter that Paul wrote where he said he's arguing against these people who are saying the Christians should get circumcised. And he says, I wish that these people who are arguing in favor of circumcision would just go the whole way and emasculate themselves. He's basically saying, don't just cut off the tip, cut the whole thing off. These guys are so stupid. So not only did the circumcision bit, but a lot of the sacrifices and a lot of the other rules were part of this failing covenant that Jesus replaced. So it is quite explicit within the Bible how there's instructions that are for a specific time and place. So I don't need to follow the rule that says I need to go to Jerusalem once a year and sacrifice a goat. That's not a contradiction because the text itself made it clear that this was not intended to be a rule for all time. And likewise, the instruction to the Israelites that they must kill all of the Amalekites doesn't really make any difference to me because there's no Amalekites left, and I'm also not an Israelite. But it is interesting. I mean, it's worth thinking about. How does my conception of God match with somebody who would command the extermination of a of an ethnic group? That's something I need to think through and make sure that that's not that's not a contradiction with my conception of God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, because the way you're describing it suggests that he God didn't regret the various genocides in the Old Testament and so on. That
No,
the Christian God as of today is still compatible with those things that it was right for them to do.
yeah, I think that's correct. I think the God that we, as modern day Christians in 2022, the God that we worship, is the same God with the same moral compass that commanded the destruction of those tribes, in the ancient Near East. It's like God is in control of everything that happens, and he believes, and God clearly believes that ultimately mankind deserves death and destruction and judgment. And so what he was doing was simply bringing about that judgment and justice to that particular group of people at that time. It's actually an excess of patience that God doesn't exterminate everybody immediately. Is more the way around I think of it being. So people say, oh, isn't it unfair that God treats some people well and some people badly? And I think the correct answer is it's terribly unfair, because everybody deserves judgment, and some people get away with much better outcome than what their behavior or their actions or their, whether those actions emanated from free will or not. The things that they've done offend God and are rightly deserving of judgment. And so the status quo, the fair outcome, would be everybody being judged. And yet some people get better than they deserve. And so it is unfair. If fairness is what you care about, then it's kind of bad news, I guess.
So let me ask you. So according to your version, that doesn't really include much free will, because just like we said, that the sort of theodicy, the problem of evil, that it's so central to a lot of thinkers in Western history, and the sort of the wiggle room, just like you said, has been free will. That
Right.
the world is better because of free will, and that must allow us to do evil things or bad things, and so bad things happen. And if you don't allow that, what do you do about the problem of evil? Do you just not acknowledge that it exists? Or it seems very intuitively clear that if God is all powerful, all good, he could help everyone. And if he's all good, if he's really morally infallible, of course he would. But still, he allows enormous suffering. And even for people who haven't really done anything wrong. I mean, there are children who are born with incredibly painful diseases and things like that. So how do you deal with that?
I think it's worth diving in and really exploring this. But if you want a one sentence answer to how I think about this question, I think that there is some kind of justification that God has that means that the world without suffering would not have been as good. So I guess I'm just saying God has a morally justified reason for evil. And a fair follow-up question would be, what is that justification? Like, if not free will, what is it? And I don't think I have a clear answer to that, except to say I have some ideas, which I can go into. But I think more fundamentally, the person who's proposing that there's a contradiction has to say that they know that there can't be a morally justified reason. And I think that claim is quite hubristic. The Bible's basic position is that we, as small-minded humans who don't really understand most of reality, aren't really in a position to judge God. And so we see something that looks like an unjustifiable moral outrage, but what we're seeing is just a tiny corner of reality, almost like a super zoomed in view of a mosaic. You just see a couple of tiles. And if we had God's view, it would make sense. But we have to have the humility to know that that God is fundamentally greater than us in a way that we will never approach. But I think if there is a clue in the Bible about the priorities of God, we see it in passages that talk about God's glory. And I don't say this as a dogmatic answer, because I think a lot of people struggle with this as an answer. But I actually think I find it quite compelling that actually the reason that almost anything was created was as part of God's self-glorification. Now, it would be wrong for us to glorify ourselves, and so we react against the idea of God glorifying himself. But I think the reason it's wrong for us to glorify ourselves is because all glory belongs to God. And it may be that through a world full of suffering and full of evil, God is able to demonstrate his own goodness and greatness to the universe and tell the most magnificent story of all time in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And the people who have to suffer and their lives aren't even worth living are sort of that is a negative, that is a downside that is outweighed by God's gloriousness.
So the conclusion must be then that well, God is all good, but we're not in a position to know really what goodness is.
Yeah, there's that God teaches us the goodness that matters for ourselves. So God guides us to the behaviors that we need to follow, but God doesn't necessarily reveal every part of the picture and everything that we would need in order to fulfill his role. You know, God is God, and we are not God. And although mankind is in the image of God, that is not an equality. There's no way in which we can expect to be able to take God's position and act in God's shoes.
All right.
Well, we touched on a lot of really interesting stuff there. So I think you picked a great passage. Was there any last thoughts that you wanted to put across? And if not, it would be great if you could tell people about your channel. And I encourage people to go and find you on Telegram and all of that. So, but first of all, any last thoughts on Exodus 4?
Not really. I just think it sort of highlights because one idea that I have sort of a problem with is the idea that without Christianity, people wouldn't have moral knowledge, and that all moral knowledge comes from Christianity or comes from the Bible and so on. And it seems to me that it's kind of vague and it's kind of difficult to discern a moral knowledge from the Bible or from Christianity without any other sort of sources. I mean, the church fathers, for example, were educated in Greek philosophy, and a lot of stuff came in. Moral ideas came in through philosophy and not really from Christianity, and so I think that there are very sort of popular misconceptions about this, And that's sort of what I wanted to highlight with choosing this passage, that, well, you can't really discern a very clear morality. And like you said, I mean, toward the end here, that, well, if it's a very complex issue, then maybe we're not in a position then to understand to understand what's good or what's not good. So that sort of re-emphasizes the point that the moral knowledge is kind of vague. But thank you so much for having me on. Anyone who wants to see my work can find me at, well, I have a Telegram channel, Guide to Culture, and culture is Kulchur. It's a book by Ezra Pound, Guide to Culture, that I named it after. So people can find me there. So Guide to Culture, Kulchur. And the website is gtkradio.com. So thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining, and I had a great time. And you bring a lot of very thoughtful and interesting ideas, and yeah. So I really encourage people to come and to check your stuff out, and I'd love to have you back on the channel someday.
I'd love to. Thank you.